Hey there, and welcome to the Dynamics Hot Dish Podcast, serving up stories and knowledge on Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform. This is What's Hot in Dynamics. You're now joining Merlin Schweiger, Liz McGlennon, and Ashley Steiner.
Oh, I don't know if I can tell it. I have a funny story. So Tom has a new hire, or it's not on his team. He has a new hire at work, like a new guy on the other team. And he fell asleep on a client call in front of the customer.
Like video on?
Yes. In the office, in a room with his coworkers. But he was like sitting behind them. And so his coworkers couldn't see that he had fallen asleep, but the client could. And they were like, hey, are you so-and-so? Or like, are you sleeping?
You get fired for that?
He didn't.
Asking for a friend.
But the CEO called him into the office and like gave him a ton of shit and like screamed at him. And like Tom was walking in when he was walking out and he was like beet red and like very, very upset. But I guess it's not the first time this guy has fallen asleep at work there either. He's like 2 weeks in. And it's his first like real job.
Does he have narcolepsy? Is that what it's called when you sleep all the time? Or like
no, like we're just guessing that like he's probably not going to bed early enough. Like he has a real job, you know.
He hasn't figured out that it's time to be an adult now.
Right. He's probably like younger because I did that when I was younger too.
Yeah.
I didn't fall asleep at work, but I would go to work like so tired that you were almost not functional.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like if you're gonna fall asleep, like you should stand up, you should get caffeine. Like there's ways to prevent yourself from falling asleep at work. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, now if I'm not in bed by like 9:30. Like...
Yes.
So Merlin, at your age, it must be like 8:30.
Oh, I mean, yeah.
The kids go down, you go down.
Pretty much. Last night, Nora was like, oh, can you come with me to go get, I don't know, something from her room? And I was like, do I have to get up? Can't you just go by yourself? I'm so sleepy. This was at like 7:45.
So funny.
You know, get my tum all full of dinner and just go right to sleep.
That's so early.
I didn't actually go to bed then.
Were you falling asleep in the recliner?
Like a grandpa?
Because I will say that I fall asleep in the recliner all the time. Like watching a movie and it's like 9:30 and I'm like, oh, it's like midnight. No, it's 9:30.
Yeah.
As I was falling asleep last night in my recliner, like I typically do on a Thursday evening, I was thinking about like our last week podcast, how we talked about XRM Toolbox and ways that you can take a look at what you've designed or put out there beforehand, like the attribute usage one. You can see I actually ran that against our system this week and just kind of want to know, was thinking about like, hey, what do you do before you even get to that point that it's deployed? So maybe we should talk about some things like for UI best practices and design best practices to get people on board quickly and well.
It's a good
Liz,
idea.
What are you thinking or what ideas do you have?
Well, I think there's a lot of different components to UI. So there's kind of the overall UI of the app potentially that the end user is working in, but then you have all the different components of, you know, the form, the views, etc. So I think there's a lot to consider when trying to make a efficient, easy to use system. Especially, you know, we don't have complete control, but there are a lot of things you can influence through out of the box configuration.
It's true. I'm curious, do you draw a distinction between UI best practices and UX best practices? So like the interface versus the experience, or are they kind of lumped together?
I personally lump them together. I don't know if that's the right thing, but I kind of just, think of them as one and the same.
I intertwine them as well because as I'm designing out a form or something, I'm always going to think about how the person's going to end up using it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that works in a like Dynamics or a model-driven app experience. I think in a Canvas app experience, they probably are a little bit more separated just because you're designing more of the UI from the ground up, whereas, you know, model-driven or Dynamics, you're using the UI that Microsoft has given you, and then it's saying, well, what do I do with it to make it a little bit better? And that I feel falls more on the experience side.
Yeah, I think that's a fair distinction. Definitely. That makes sense.
And I've never built a Canvas app, so I'm intrigued to hear, like, that should definitely be another topic, because I'd love to hear from the ground up, like, how that works.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, it's also a bit challenging, but it's fun. So within Dynamics, if we're thinking about UI best practices and some of the things that we do, since Liz, you mentioned all of the different areas, maybe let's start with on a form. From your perspective, what are some of the things that you think about when you're designing a form to make it better for the user?
Sure. I guess one thing I like to do that I don't see commonly done are the tool tips. So like if you put in text in the description of the field, like, and you hover over the field, then you get that pop-up label. And so if a field is maybe not super self-explanatory, like that's just extra reinforcement of, hey, this is what this field is used for. So I think that's really nice. I think the other thing that I see people miss is thinking about how the form works if you tab through the fields. I think a lot of people assume like someone's using a mouse or a touch screen, but I think there's still a lot of end users that are kind of like old school and they might tab through it, and that might be their preference. And so just to consider like all forms of interaction when you're placing like the fields or subgrids or whatever on the form.
I agree.
Really good point.
Yeah, that's actually something that I like always have in my mind. And that's actually something I wrote down today. It was like, make sure you talk about tabbing, because all of my salespeople, especially now that everybody's like in this COVID world, I would say that they're not on their phones as much. They're not using the mobile app, or like, they don't have the iPad out on the road or whatever. They are sitting at a desk making calls and doing video conferences. So they're going to be entering things in on a laptop, a computer, whatever they have. And so I always try to arrange the fields in a way where they're logically going to fill them out in order, because then they can just tab through them, especially in like today's environment.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that people kind of can overlook is that you have a header and a footer, and like you can use those for fields that aren't used as often maybe, or like, they need special attention maybe in the header, and like the footer is nice for anything that you want to show, but you don't have to edit it. So I just think those are like kind of undervalued sometimes in form design, and people just kind of focus on the body of the form.
And I've always used the header for things that, like, I don't want to say that they're required, but you want to draw attention to them, because I really try to limit the number of required fields when creating new things. I primarily work with salespeople and they hate filling out data, right? So I use the headers to like draw attention, like, hey, this is important down the road. You don't have to fill it out today. But it's there staring them in the face every time they open like an account or an opportunity. So.
Those are good points. Honestly, I had never considered the tab thing, which is kind of funny because as an older person, as we've previously discussed on this podcast, I often tab through applications, but I don't think about that when I'm designing a Dynamics form, because I'm not thinking about it as from the user perspective, right? I'm thinking about it from the consulting perspective, which is I just have to get these fields on here and they need to do these things, and less from actually walking through it as a user, which I think is a good reminder.
And I think that the training, like when I do training with people and I always have them share their screen, like, hey, you walk me through how you're doing it. That's where you get some of the best ideas from on how to enhance things that you've already put together. That's where the tabbing, I never would have thought to tab either, but salespeople just want to use their keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
It is a lot faster.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think understanding how they're going to do their job in the system is the key part there. You can, gather, you can probably make assumptions through like what through requirements gathering and the user stories and all that, but also like Ashley, you said kind of job shadowing, where actually watching them work in the system could probably add more insight to of things you might have not thought of or caught kind of on the initial design.
And that's interesting to me, because I would have thought, because when Microsoft, obviously this new UI, the tabs are across the top, right? In Dynamics specifically. And so I thought that was awesome, because I was like, oh my gosh, you don't have to scroll anymore. Like everything can be above the fold, which is a marketing term, right? And you can just tab in between all the different sections, fill out the fields. And I very quickly found out that salespeople hate that, and probably most users do. So on the customer service marketing side as well, they're like, no, I just want to scroll, or I want to like put in, my find thing and then type in the field that I'm looking for. They're used to it. They want to scroll. They want everything to be on that front page, even if they have to scroll a little bit to find it. So I've really had to change like my thinking, because I was like, oh, let's do like 6 tabs, but maybe now it's only 3 tabs, but they have a lot of sections on them. Salespeople love that for some reason. So it might not be what I want, but it's what they want.
Yeah, and that was a big change going from like kind of the previous interface to the unified interface. I wanted to ask that because I've had very different opinions on projects of, should everything be on one screen and you scroll, or should you split it out into a bunch of tabs and try to have everything on a screen be above the fold, like you said, actually, like where you don't have to scroll. So it's interesting that your users actually don't like the tabs.
Yeah, and that's been common across multiple, even when I was a consultant working with companies, a lot of them didn't want a lot of tabs. Like I always remember getting it out to like the end users, they hated the tabs, but the like systems people at the company's IT, or whoever was and ahead of the project, they loved the tabs. So I think it's just a different because I like the tabs, but I'm not the one using the system every day.
Right.
Yeah, that is interesting. I feel like there's probably an element of that now that maybe is a little bit more important with the unified interface, because it is responsive. So to try to get everything above the fold, you don't actually know where the fold is, because you don't know how big the screen is on the device that person is using.
Or are they zoomed in or zoomed out, or
right, like, or their magnification is on because their screen is halfway across the room and their eyesight's bad. Or they're using a Surface, which if you try to use it as native resolution is impossible to see anyway. So I feel like there's that might be a little bit of a fool's errand now to try to keep everything above the fold and make all those multiple tabs. So it's kind of interesting then that I wonder why do the IT people like the tabs, but the users don't like the tabs?
What
is it about tabs for IT people?
Like you think about like when you have your browser open and you have Google Chrome, like I open up like a different tab for everything. Like I always have 15 tabs open. Every salesperson that I know has a different window open for every little thing that they're looking at, because it's just a way to keep them organized. I don't know. It's just a different way of thinking about things or personality.
It's just interesting.
Yeah, it's like different habits almost.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
So I wanted to talk about the responsive design, Marlene, because I think that that's a big one when you're talking about subgrids, because depending on how you're zoomed in or out, it might look like the traditional subgrid that we're used to, or it's going to go into that like little form box where it only shows 3 pieces of data.
Do you like that new subgrid view? Like that thing drives me nuts. I'm like, I want the old subgrid back.
I like it in some cases, but not others. And that's where it's hard, because you don't know which one's going to appear, but depending on how they're zoomed. Right. And then also because it's responsive, if you have 3 columns, that 3rd column is going to go down to the bottom if they're too zoomed in. So then they're like, my screen doesn't look like yours. And so it's a whole, that responsive design, I want to say it's great, but it also causes some of those headaches when you're trying to get everyone on board, because their screen's not going to look like yours.
Yeah, or if they're trying to follow like documentation or training video, and they're trying to go step by step and they're seeing something totally different, I could see how that would be frustrating or difficult. Yeah,
that's a good point. And I feel like that was like I sort of go back and forth on the responsiveness of the unified interface forms, because on the one hand, to your point, Ashley, like that's really cool that like I can just build one form and it'll work everywhere. But on the other hand, your user experience is going to be so dramatically different, because if I'm on a screen where I can fit all 3 columns, I can put a field at the top of each column, and those will be the most important fields that will show up at the top if I'm on my computer. But if I pull it up on my phone, I'm going to get one important field here, and then I'm scroll, one important field there, scroll, one important field there. And so it changes the experience so much that I guess I question if it's still valuable to use the responsive design and only design one form, or if it's still a better idea to try to design different forms for different experiences and have like, this is the app for mobile devices and it has all the mobile like optimized forms, and this is the app for everybody on the computer and it's got the computer optimized form.
What if when you're designing the one form though, you just know that it does that, and so you don't put the fields across the top? Also, you would never tab that way, like it tabs down first. So I just think it's
true.
You have to remember that when you're building out your form, that these are my top 4 fields and I'm going to stack them vertically in the left column.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I agree with you, because I mean, I can see the benefits of both, right? Is like having this is for mobile, this is for the web, because you do use them differently. I can totally see a benefit in that, but from a management standpoint, I would hate to have to manage 2 different apps for 2 different things. Also, salespeople love that when they go to their mobile phone, while the responsive design makes it look different, it's still the same. So they're like, oh,
Sure.
I need this field. I know that it's in this box titled this, and I can just scroll until I find it. So I've actually found better adoption of the mobile app since the responsive design has been out, because it doesn't look different for them. And I mean, even in the wave 1 changes coming, they're still making changes to the mobile app to make it easier to use in the responsive design.
Nice.
All right. Good points.
Yeah,
Good
the
points.
mobile app is dramatically improved. Like if you haven't looked at the mobile app since Unified Interface, revisit it.
Agreed.
It's much better.
True. All right. Have we beaten forms to death? Do you have any ideas about views?
I have one more form comment.
Okay.
And it ties into views, so it's perfect transition. So you know how you can label a field on the form, and then there's also the display name of the field. One of my biggest pet peeves is when they're different, because it's one thing on the form, and then if the end user is ever looking at it in a view or trying to build an advanced find, they don't know what field it is. And it just like, I think it's super frustrating, and it's like the best way to get them to not use advanced find, because they just don't know.
I agree. I actually walked into a system that had a lot of display names that are different than the name in the back end, and it was hard for me. Like I would have to constantly go back and like pull up the form and say, okay, what does the display name change to? Why can't I find it? So I had trouble. So I can't imagine trying to like teach my users to do.
And most end users don't have permissions to pull up the form designer, or aren't going to have some add-in like level up to check it. Like they're not going to have any way to know unless they go to someone that's a system admin and like ask them to check what the display name is.
And it's really hard to do advanced find training when at the end of it you say, oh, and if you don't know what the field name is, let me know. Because then they're like, well, just build it for me.
Yeah. Yes. I've seen systems like that, and I just feel so bad for the end users because they're just so stuck.
I agree.
That is a great tip. Don't do that, kids. Don't change the label on the form. You'll confuse everybody.
And I have noticed, I feel like previously, if you changed the field display name, it would update it. Like you didn't have to manually change them both, or am I crazy?
It does not update both. Yeah, I think you're crazy.
Okay. I feel like it used to do that, but yeah, I noticed it doesn't, and I'm like, well, that's great.
No, it definitely doesn't do that. That is a good segue. So view design.
Limit your columns.
Yeah. Try not to put too much on your view, and put all the useful stuff on the left where it'll actually show up.
But not a related record name. Like if the first column is a hyperlink to not the record, and it takes them like the owner, for example, and it takes them to the user record every time, or the parent record, that confuses users so bad. Like don't click here, but click anywhere else.
I know. And it's so hard to be like, well, everything blue is a hyperlink, so it's going to take you somewhere. And then they're like, okay, well, where is it going to take me? And then maybe they end up somewhere that they don't need it to be.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult to train. So I always try to make that first column the record, because it's a nightmare otherwise.
Yeah.
I'd also say,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to switch topics. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, it needs to either be the hyperlink to the appropriate record or like not a non-hyperlink column, definitely. And I guess my other comment from a view perspective for advanced find is if you're not using a field, don't have it be searchable. You can limit the amount of fields that you see in the advanced find list, and that also really helps users adopt advanced find.
On that
Yes.
note, though, if you are using the field, do make it searchable.
Yeah.
Because
Yes. That
I've come across systems where they like make everything unsearchable, and it's like, well, I need that in a view, or they don't think that you're gonna need it.
Why
really
wouldn't
painful.
you make a custom field searchable?
No idea.
I've never like heard of no, because if they're not gonna see it or use it, you would do field level security. Like if there was a legitimate reason for them not to use or see that field.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the other thing I was going to say
Oh.
go ahead, Marlon.
No, I was just going to piggyback on that and say I've always sort of wished that if I turned off searchable, so it doesn't show up in the list of fields that I can add in my advanced find, but it still shows up if you're trying to add columns. And I always sort of wish that I could turn that off too.
That's true.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
So what I was gonna say is, like, speaking of view design, I also try to limit the number of views that are on a table inside of a model-driven app, because I have heard so many people complain, like, I don't know which view to use, or I have all these options in here, and I'm like, oh, don't use that one, it's not applicable. And they're like, well, then why is it in here?
Yes. That's one of the best things about model-driven apps. And if you're not using model-driven apps, use model-driven apps.
Yes.
Like have at least one, because then you can streamline all of that. Yeah.
Yep. You turn off all those forms that you've gotten from all of your upgrades. Your account form has like 16 different forms, and your users are like, oh, I don't know which one to use. Just put one. Just put one in there. And then just give them that one, and it's the only one that they'll ever see, and they won't know that there were others. Same thing with the views.
And dashboards, and the left
And
navigation.
Yep. 100% agree.
And what's funny is a couple of waves ago, I have no idea when it was sometime in 2020, they now put the my views on top. So when you go and like do the drop down, change your view, like all those views that you've created, like 10 years ago, if you're at the same organization, like they're all there now at the top. So it's kind of a great reminder to also clean up things that you've created like custom just for yourself, because that's all it's not gonna be hidden at the bottom anymore.
Well, no, just leave those there forever. In a previous system that I saw, so sort of tying back to the too many views, they wanted to build a bunch of system dashboards because the users didn't know how to build the dashboards. So they built system dashboards, but to drive the system dashboards, they needed a bunch of system views. And so then when you were trying to find a system view, there was like this block at the top of like, I don't know, 8 different views that all had like number 1, and then a block that all had number 2. And I was just like,
I hate that. Or how about when they start like AA or like A dash or like ZZ to like just order them?
Right.
That
it's like
drives me nuts. It's like just
see what you're trying to do, but it's not.
I've seen that on columns though. So like on fields, if they're not using this one anymore, they'll put ZZ so it shows up at the bottom so people don't select it. What do you guys think of that?
See, and I feel like that goes back to I wish that if I turned off the searchable that it wouldn't show up as a column that I could add, but because it still does, I feel like that's a situation where if you're legitimately not using that field actively anymore, you put a Z at the front of it, at least it goes down to the bottom of that list. I mean, you could argue if you're not using it anymore, why is it still there? But maybe you still need that data for some reason.
You can move the data.
That sounds like work, Liz. It's a lot easier to just change the display name to have a ZZ in front of it.
If you're putting ZZ in front of it, then you better put do not use on the end too. Like I would hate to see just a ZZ field without a do not use label. Like I think the do not use label is helpful if that you're really in that situation.
Right.
Because you can't inactivate fields, right? You can only delete them.
No, and if you delete them, you lose the data in it. Merlin, did you say you don't have to delete it?
No, I'm saying deleting it would mean if I needed that data, then I got to put that data somewhere else. Sounds like a whole big process. I'll just put some Z's on the display name and then forget about it, right? Like that's sort of the easy answer.
Right. Because there's not a way to hide it from the end user, but keep it in the database.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So what you end up with is like a bunch of spreadsheets with like, oh, here's all the exported data from this field and exported data from this field. I've seen that too.
Yeah, I guess I could see that. I feel like the true answer now would be replicate that snapshot out to your connected Azure data lake and then just delete the field because you don't need it anymore.
And if you don't know what a data lake is, Merlin describes it to us in a previous podcast.
Yeah, you put all your data in and you swim around.
Okay, can I ask about, you know how when you create a new entity, table, sorry, and there's that name, that out of the box name field that you get. My first question is, do you guys leave it as a name or do you like try to relabel it to something that's like more useful?
Depends. I know that's not a great answer, but it depends on what I'm building. So
I was going to say the same.
Yeah, it's such a cop-out answer though. Because like depending on, it's a hard question to answer. I don't even know like a better way to answer it than just it depends.
Okay, that's fair.
I think probably 95% of the time I leave it as name.
Okay, I do too.
But
I just
there
didn't
is-
know if I was being like lazy by leaving it as name most of the time.
I mean, I feel like there was a point at which I started changing it to be like whatever that table was and then name. So like if I'm creating a site visit, it'd be like site visit name.
But you know you're on that table. So like it seems redundant to me.
Indeed. And also this was a long time ago. And so anytime that I was building a report and I was typing out the schema name of the field, it was a lot longer to type out in my report query than just name. So I stopped doing it. And yeah.
Well, that makes me feel better. So my next question is, you know how I feel like there's always entities where like it doesn't really need a name though, right? Like you don't really want to make them type something in. And so I have a way.
I auto-populate it with like a workflow or business process flow.
That's what I was gonna ask. That's what I do too, Ashley. Like I autofill it and I usually concatenate like two other useful pieces of information that they are collecting on that record.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
I try to do that whenever I can, especially for salespeople, fill in fields based on other data that they put in. Because, I mean, let's just be honest, salespeople hate data entry. I hate data entry. So, like, salespeople, I can't even imagine.
Data entry.
Right. And so yeah, I try to do that whenever, but especially on that name field, if especially if they don't see it. I mean, sometimes you just hide it because it's not necessary for them to see.
But I don't like leaving it blank because if it gets used on a view or an advanced find somewhere, like it's helpful to have it populated.
Agree.
Yeah.
It's true.
But yeah, I would hide it on the form. Yeah, hide it on the form and make it unrequired if they don't need it.
Absolutely.
I think auto-populating to like another piece of functionality I see people forget to use is like data mapping. So if you're creating like a child record from a parent record, like you can auto-populate data through data mapping, which is just a really nice, easy feature.
It's true. Although sometimes it's annoying when that happens, like automatically to too many lookups. I don't know if this is still a problem.
What do you mean?
Or if either of you have ever encountered it, but like if you create a child record that has like multiple lookups to the same parent, so like imagine you create some sort of table that has like 3 links to accounts, like the parent account and also like a vendor and also like a third party, all 3 of them will populate with that automatically. And so then you have to like go back and do some trickery to like blank out the ones that you didn't want it to fill. It can be kind of problematic.
Yeah.
Is trickery code?
Maybe.
Define. Okay.
Trickery. It's hocus pocus. Could be code. Maybe it's a business rule. Maybe it's a workflow or a flow.
So one thing we haven't talked about that I really like rolling out for people are business process flows. And I think that changes kind of the UI and how they work with tables like opportunities, cases. And that's how I try to also limit like, hey, you don't have to fill out so much data. And then trick them into, oh, but you have to fill it out later as you move along in the process.
Yeah.
But it's also, you can like phrase it differently. Like, hey, it's now a checklist. I think business process flows are really underutilized. I don't know if you guys see that, but I love to throw them on entities where it makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I like to use them. It just means that there has to be a semi-defined process to follow, but they're a nice like guideline, to say like, hey, here's the data we care about capturing now. Here's your next steps. Like, I think they're very helpful. Yes.
And it's a good way to sort of spread out your required fields, right? Because it's like, well, before the opportunity closes, I need to have this information, but nobody's going to have it when it opens. Process flow is a great way to get that required in the process flow at that stage, and then you don't need to worry about setting it as a required field overall.
Yep.
Or using business rules to require fields later on. So depending on their answers,
Mhm.
I love to do that. And I probably use it way too often because people think like, oh, I'm done. And then they go to hit save and it's like, nope, more required fields based on your previous entry.
Yeah, I like to use business rules a lot to hide and show or like set default values too. Like I think that really helps. You know, if a field's only needs to be there like conditionally, like some of the time, it's really easy to write a business rule for that.
Except you can't do it on the multi-option set.
I know. I just found that out this week. It is so frustrating. I was like, we were like, why isn't this working? Oh, it doesn't work on multi-selects.
Like you can't do processes on them either. It's horrible. Like
Multi-selects are the worst.
They are. And I really try to avoid using them, but in some cases, like there's just
they're
there
them. Yeah.
And you need them. And it's better than doing like 4 different fields of checkboxes or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just wish that those were a little more developed and hopefully someday maybe. But,
I know. I feel like they haven't enhanced them since they came out.
But they also haven't enhanced editable grids since they came out, and they are doing that in this wave coming up in April. So maybe it's like they're just chipping away at the things that were like almost there, as I call them.
That's true.
Like Microsoft was like, good enough.
Yeah. So speaking of check boxes, like for yes, no fields, like a few years ago, like I would always say like change the yes, no to a checkbox. But these days, like with the toggle control and the mobile app, like do you guys still feel like the checkbox is the best like UI option for the yes, no, or do you is the toggle better?
I've actually completely switched to the toggle.
Okay.
It's also more visual. I like to add anything like those custom controls, any of those custom controls that I can add where it makes sense. Like I've seen some people go crazy with them and it's like, just like a dial here and a button here and but I mean, where it makes sense, I try to use some of those custom controls because it just makes the form not look so plain, so much white space. It makes it just a little more intriguing, which I know like from a salesperson's perspective, they're never going to be like, oh, look at this like custom field with the like little speed dial, but it does make it a little less like mundane, I guess.
Yeah. And I feel like people complain all the time about the too much white space in the system.
You gotta add a little color.
Yeah, exactly. And I like to do them that way. So it makes it just a little more interesting.
Yeah, I don't think those are used enough either. Like it's easy to kind of forget that they're there and they're easy now, like because that was not an easy thing to do previously.
It's super easy now in the Maker portal to add them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you can even add custom controls for views. So like you can take an activity view and make it a calendar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love doing that. That's, I think, a way better visualization than a grid, like a subgrid. Yeah.
Well, and that's what salespeople always ask for. They're like, hey, I want this activity to show up on my Outlook calendar, but it's not going to. It's going to sync to somewhere else in Outlook. So this is kind of like how you can do the best of both worlds. Like, hey, here's your calendar in Dynamics showing you everything. And then if they're syncing their appointments back from Outlook, it can kind of give them that happy medium.
Mm-hmm.
It's true. Great points. Great points all. Any parting thoughts?
I do. I have one of my biggest pet peeves that we haven't talked about.
Then you better bring it up.
Is custom entities with the puzzle piece icon. Like you should update your custom entity icons. We can put a link to resources for that. And there is an iconator, like a utility in the Xroom toolbox that helps you update them and makes the process easier. But it's not hard. It's just picking out pictures and uploading them as web resources. So please do that. That drives me nuts.
It drives me nuts when they're in the command bar too. So if you're adding like a custom button, and then I don't know if you can do it now in the new UI. I've heard it's really difficult to change the like icon in the new command bar, but maybe I don't know.
I haven't
because it's
tried
all code.
That. Yeah.
So yeah, but that drives me insane.
So
well, speaking of the command, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, so my app that's like all puzzle pieces down the left, that you wouldn't like to use that app?
As long as they fit together, maybe, but it's all the same puzzle piece. So
that's true.
I don't know why it bothers me so much. I just think it's like, you don't want to read, like, I feel like I know what some of the icons are, and I feel like you've used the system enough. Like, it just adds, like, if you're more visual, like, there's the picture for this record type versus, like, having to read the names. Like, I just think it helps.
It also looks unfinished to me.
Yeah.
It's like, we didn't have enough time to like fully complete this. So what else is missing?
Right. It's just unpolished.
It's fair.
Yeah. So I was gonna say like one other thing about the command bar, depending on like what they're using, like sometimes word templates are in the ellipsis. Like if that is something they're gonna use all the time, like I like to kind of prioritize the order of the command bar or hide things that they don't need, just to streamline kind of the options and not show actions that they're not gonna use or have something that they're gonna click on every time under the ellipsis menu.
It's a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Just like prioritizing the columns in your views.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Ashley, did you have any parting thoughts? Any pet peeves we haven't discussed?
Yeah, I'd say the only pet peeve I have is when your tabs roll over. If you have so many tabs on a form and it rolls over into, I just call it the related button because there's no like name for it. I don't know if it's more commands or whatever. It's the 3 dots at the end. I hate it when tabs roll over into that because it's really confusing to an end user, like, okay, this isn't actually related stuff, it's actually another tab. And then also because of the different screen sizes, you just don't know how many they're gonna see. So having like 15 tabs is never the solution. I would just throw that out there. So trying to limit the number of tabs you have.
Mm-hmm.
People don't mind scrolling, they're used to it. So that's a huge
I
pet
agree.
peeve of mine.
I've never seen a system that does that, so I must be lucky to never have had that many tabs.
I'll demo my system for you sometime, Liz.
I trust you. I can picture it. I believe you.
I was gonna say let's just do a screen share later. You can see a couple. All right, good discussion. I think probably we should wrap it up here, or we'll go all day. But thank you both for your inputs, and thanks everyone else for listening to my pithy comments.
Thanks, Merlin.
Thank you for listening to the Dynamics Hot Dish podcast. For additional content and previous episodes, check out our website at dynamicshotdish.com, follow us on Twitter at dynamicshotdish, and subscribe to our podcast for notifications. Thanks. See you next time.